this realization during your segment there that like it was just this impact of, wow, I wonder how much of the results of my vulnerability are things that I will never witness.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Whether it's like immediate rippling out of the vulnerability. Like if I'm vulnerable here with this person in this relationship, and that ripples out where they go feel more capable of being vulnerable and creating other relationships, or this whole communal idea of like, I mean, even being vulnerable, raising children, being vulnerable with your kids, because that was never, I mean, that wasn't a thing
right
that parents in our generation did, right? But admitting being wrong, not knowing something. I mean, there's just, it can play out in so many ways that the long lasting effect of that kind of vulnerability. And then I think the communal vulnerability, you know, having communal spaces where vulnerability is accepted. God, I mean that, because then that ripples out in the same way, but then also like all of that ripples out into the future in ways that like, oh wow, I would never know, you know, the impact of what each of us are doing, what we're doing as a community, what we're doing as society. That's kind of a cool thing to think about, you know.
Well, it does give new context to, you know, to like how we interact with the world, right? You know, and we talk about often, I think sometimes in New Thought, some of the criticism may be that that's focus on the individual, my individual work, and not this kind of outward facing. And I would also support that criticism at times. And so I think that this focus on kind of this individual vulnerability and really kind of getting really clear what that is and how that is in our own life, then we can be able, I think it is important for us to focus on that, because there's no way that we can create spaces for other people to be vulnerable if we have not traveled or are not traveling that journey as well. So I think this is like one of the areas where it is important for us to really get really clear about, you know, our authentic selves and you know, that self-discovery, that curiosity, that self-reflection, that self shifting, you know, that we've talked about, and then how that then ripples out into our communities. Because then it can't help but if we're doing that work and exploring that in our own sort of lives, it can't help but then kind of get spilled off into our interactions, because then we're going to show up differently to this situation than maybe we have before. We're going to show up differently to families or to friends or to groups or to communities. And then when I show up differently, then maybe it inspires someone to say, huh, I wonder how I could show up differently if it's something that is theirs to do. And then it just, like you say, it becomes this impact that we don't really know the long-term effects of. But that's I think what we're talking about is like cultivating this into where it just overflows, and then we begin to see monumental shifts when we're all doing this, and then we really can't see the effects, right?
You know, go back for a minute to this self-discovery piece. I think we inadvertently, the larger we, whoever is teaching these things,
the big W,
you know, I think we teach self-discovery, self-awareness, whatever, you know, self-development, as if there at some point will be a conclusion. So once you've done your personal work, then and only then are you collected enough where you can bring that out and do that out with society or whatever. And I hope that that's not done intentionally.
Wrong answer.
But I think it is certainly felt that way in a lot of places. I think it's inadvertently taught that way. Maybe in some places it's taught that way intentionally, right? Like it's all about you, the self-reliant individual, and only you and your consciousness, as if there's somehow a slice of consciousness that is yours, and you, like, it's all about you, the individual, and that's
mine. You can't touch it.
Yeah. And it's weird because that's where we get this like hierarchy in nature, like we're above everything else, and
Yeah.
life is resources for us to obtain, and blah blah blah. But regardless of how it's taught, I think the implication is often that it is a journey with a specific finish line, that once we cross that, then we're like acceptable for human consumption out in the world. But until then, we're all supposed to keep that work to ourselves and do it inwardly and whatever. And I think it's sounding like it's the same thing with vulnerability. That vulnerability has been talked about as if, or at least never talked about in a different way, but talked about in a way that is, yeah, you have to like complete your vulnerability journey before we can collectively be vulnerable as a group, before we can collectively be vulnerable as a community, as a society. And just like with the self-discovery thing,
We'll
that's
never
totally
get
not,
there if that's the
yeah,
case.
right. There is, right. So in case it's not clear, there is no finish line. There is no
Yes.
done, right? This is for forever. Like we can get better at it. It becomes easier at times, but there is no done, right? And so, yeah, we have to begin the vulnerability thing out in the world before we feel like we're ready. We have to begin vulnerability with relationships, with our community, with our society, before we are like ready to do it.
Otherwise, it wouldn't be vulnerability,
You're right.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
that really weird, like it takes, it's like you're not, it's like half baked. You're half baked, and now we're gonna,
Yeah.
begin to like try that out, try that on for size, and as we're interacting and applying. And I think because this journey, going back to the self discovery that you talked about, because that journey is never over. Then of course, kind of vulnerability is kind of like holding hands with self discovery.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of on the same path together. And so the more that we kind of get clear or get more and more clear, or this layer, now this layer, now this layer, of kind of being our authentic selves and how that shows up and how that can shift and move and as we know ourselves more. And that's the same thing with vulnerability and authenticity, right? As we begin to know, stand firmer and firmer in our values or take on new values, or our values shift as our experiences in life shift, then it creates a whole new opportunity to explore what that authenticity and vulnerability looks like from that space.
Yeah.
So my space today is different from my space tomorrow, or my space when I have more information. It's life is kind of like this information gathering. So the more information we have, the more that we can utilize that in this sort of exploration of who we are, and then how that person in that moment can show up in the world.
It makes me think a lot about like the evolution of change.
Mm.
I don't know. I happen to be born at a time where the evolution of change was quickening at a like way faster than it had ever before.
Yeah.
Like there was this like leap forward in the speed of change, of technology, of life. And so I guess I kind of grew up with like change being the norm,
No.
and maybe it was things, like technology changed every 3 to 5 years, and now it's changing every 3 to 5 minutes. But like, it took a while for me in my adult life to recognize like change, how fast change was happening in my life, and how different that was from lives before me. Like, even my parents, the advent of, and there was a lot of change in their lives too. It's been extended over a long period of time, but like I have found it a good reminder to come from a place of compassion with how the rate of change has impacted lives. I think anytime we are hanging on to what was, the gap between like what was and change gets wider and wider and wider, because like what was is a constant line, change is like this parabolic arc, and so we're like further and further away. And so I think it can feel, and I think this is what we're seeing in a lot of society, especially in politics, is like the difference between that, the difference in that gap is like, it feels massive at this point. And so I can have some compassion for if we're someone still on this line and the rest of life is like, we're up here now, hello.
Hello down there.
Yeah. I think that can be really, really overwhelming, right? And I think about that even just in terms of technology. Like if you didn't keep up with technology in the 90s or early 2000s and you're still like hanging on to early word processing programs, and we're like, yeah, Google Docs is old. I think that can be a massive leap, and I think that same thing plays out in values and in life. How life shows up, the different variations of life showing up that I've always wanted to show up but couldn't for some obvious reasons before, weren't acceptable in the past.
Well,
That gap is large.
and that's where vulnerability comes in, right? Being willing to let go of what was
Yeah.
and stepping into what is, or what's the next thing. And that can be hard. And that can be, we saw that in our spiritual communities. We just want to go back to the way it was.
Yeah.
It's not. Change is hard.
Yeah.
And I think that, vulnerability is kind of that, I don't know, it seems like that kind of like that bridge sometimes in these changes, especially from one thing to the next thing. It's that vulnerability to kind of let go of this thing that we've known to be true for so long, and then begin to say, oh, well, what if it could be this way? And even asking the question is vulnerability. What if it could be this way? In that sense, transformation and this evolution can only happen through vulnerability, because then it becomes that kind of, it bridges the two things, where we were and where we are going, and we're standing where we are, and that vulnerability kind of bridges that. Yeah. And I think it's important. I mean, these conversations we have, before we got on, we're like, oh, what else is there to say about vulnerability? Because, but we talk about it a lot. And I think vulnerability becomes, we've talked about it in kind of like a discussion and educational sort of format, but I think that vulnerability and authenticity, connection, belonging, all those things become a way of life. So there are practices, I think, at first of, okay, let me practice being vulnerable. Let me kind of step out a little bit authentically and see what the temperature of that water is. But then the more we look at it, and the more it becomes this kind of new default in our minds, like, oh, okay, what is underneath that, or what's underneath that, or how can I show up authentically in this space, or how can I create vulnerability for other people to show up authentically in this space? Then it no longer, the more we look at things, the more we practice things, and the more we focus on things, then it becomes this like second nature, and so then creating spaces of authenticity and vulnerability and showing up that way in the world become a second nature as brushing your teeth in the morning. Yeah. And I think that is the purpose of these conversations. And they may sound like repetitious, like we've talked about vulnerability a million times, like what else can we say? But it's like, until we begin to live it, in that very kind of fluid, very default, that is the norm sort of way, then conversations like this are always going to be beneficial.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm looking for the day where authenticity and vulnerability are the norm. They are not the exception. And that every space and place and framework and system in our world supports that.
Well, and I think we're probably a lot closer to that than we think.
Oh, yeah. I think so.
If we look at, Gen Z, who are like now adults, I think we think Gen Z, and they're like, oh, those are the little ones. Like, no, like there's like two other generations after them at this point, right?
Yeah.
Gen Z and Gen Alpha and whatever's next. Like, I think they're really born into a world where that is the norm in a lot of ways. Yeah. And actually, I was watching an interview where they were discussing the mental health of Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and how from our perspective, from the adult perspective, they, it's like, oh, they just need to, there's something wrong with them and they need to blah, 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 or whatever. And it's like, but when you really look at like the world and how the world works and what they were born into, and then how they were, I don't know, what they were told. Even like what I was told about the world as a kid, is a huge shock as an adult. Like none of those things are true.
Yeah.
Like
we
none
get
of them.
conditioned because of what we've heard, and then we act from that conditioning.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think it's a matter of Gen Z is the first generation where I think the vulnerability that they were taught in whatever degree is actually becoming somewhat normalized as adults. Whereas, like, I don't know, the vulnerability was really discussed as a child when I was a child, but there were practices that looking back on, I think were new then, that were told to us, like, oh, you can be anything. What do you want to be when you grow up, and dream and vision and all this stuff? Except then it's like hitting a brick wall. You get out of college, it's like, well, yeah, but like life, the frameworks of life don't actually work like that. And so I think we are starting to create some new frameworks of life that may actually work like that. And so I am really kind of inspired by the fact that, like, oh, these, I was going to call them kids. They're not kids. These adults are showing up in, I mean, and even, you know, young adults, even like high school students are showing up in places and in ways that are like, they're like, no, this is not acceptable. This needs to change now.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, cool. Let's do that. Yes.
And then the lasting impact of those conversations, the lasting impact of these conversations, I think that's, it's a catalyst for a big change that's coming. I can feel it.
Yeah.
We're well up here the way it was way down there, just like you said, and just to continue just to be vulnerable enough to step into new ways of doing things, new ways of being, new ways of showing up in the world, you know, in spiritual communities and our lives and just in general. I think that all takes vulnerability, and it's uncomfortable. Vulnerability is not easy. If it was, everyone would do it, or we wouldn't even be talking about it. If it's easy, it'd be like, oh,
it's not vulnerability. Yeah. Right.
And so it is hard. And that's okay. We can, as Glennon Doyle says, we can do hard things, right? And so it's not going to be comfortable, and comfortable is not the goal. Because without a little bit of discomfort, then there is no change, there is no transformation, there is no evolution.
Yep.
And so we have to be willing to sit in the discomfort a little bit longer than we think we can, and then see what that next thing is and step out in that way. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming along this vulnerability journey that we've had this month. And we can see that when we can be willing, or just be willing to be vulnerable and to be authentic and do that in our own lives, and then create spaces for other people to do the same, then the transformative effects of vulnerability will be more than we could possibly imagine. And honestly, these lasting effects will outlive us. And we will see our legacy of vulnerability, the legacy of authenticity, the legacy of these conversations and what they create in our world. And so if you want to explore this topic a little bit deeper, we have our Thursday evening, The Gathering, at 7 p.m. You can register or sign up for that on soulevolutioncollaborative.org. It's a great time for us to come together in a kind of a small group setting and really share our own experiences of how vulnerability impacts us and what we can do in our world today. We have a lot of events, a lot of stuff happening at soulevolutioncollaborative.org, or more than I could even talk about right now. So I'm just going to encourage you to go to our website and look at all the upcoming events. And so if we don't see you Thursday or any of our other events, we will see you back here next week at Truth Be Told 2.0.